Humanity abandoned the Galactic Alliance. Fear spread across the stars. The vote was already decided before I even sat down. I knew it the moment I walked into the Grand Conclave Hall on Kepler Station and saw Ambassador Threx of the Vreth Dominion leaning back in his seat with that slow, satisfied smile on his wide gray face. He had the look of a man who had already won and was simply waiting for the losing side to realize it. His 4 eyes moved to me as I entered, and each one of them carried the same message. You are finished, and there is nothing you can do about it. I am Admiral Saravos of the Terran Compact. I have commanded fleets through asteroid fields, negotiated ceasefires in the middle of active firefights, and once kept a damaged carrier together with emergency hull foam and sheer stubbornness for 11 days until a rescue team arrived. I have never in my life walked into a room and felt as alone as I did in that hall. 14 species were seated around the curved council table. 14 flags hung from the ceiling above them, and at the far end of the table, where the human delegation had sat for almost 200 years, I pulled out my chair and sat down for what I had already decided would be the last time. The session opened the way they all did, long formal greetings in 7 languages, a recitation of the Alliance Charter's founding principles, and a slow reading of the agenda by the session clerk, a thin Marathi named Councillor Breck, who always spoke as if every word cost him money. I had sat through hundreds of these openings. Today, every second of it felt different. Today it felt like a countdown. The agenda item was listed as Resolution 7741C, Stabilization and Integration Framework for Terran Compact Member Activity. That was the official name. What it actually was, stripped of the careful language and the diplomatic softening, was a proposal to limit the size of humanity's fleet, place our outer colonies under Alliance oversight, and require all human military movement beyond our home system to be pre-approved by a committee, on which humanity held exactly 1 seat out of 14. They called it a gift of stability. I called it what it was. Threx rose to print the resolution. He was a large being, broad-shouldered, with gray skin that seemed to absorb the hall's pale light rather than reflect it. His voice was deep and carried easily without translation assistance, and he used that voice the way skilled speakers always do, slowly, carefully, letting every pause land like a stone dropped into still water. He said that humanity had grown. He said this with a small nod, as if he were complimenting a difficult student. He said that growth was natural, that expansion was understandable, but that the Alliance existed precisely to ensure that no single member species could unilaterally reshape the balance of power among the stars. He spoke about cooperation. He spoke about shared futures. He spoke for nearly 12 minutes without once looking at me. When he finally looked at me, it was only to say, "We offer this framework in the spirit of friendship and long partnership." I looked at the faces around the table. A few of them were unreadable. A few were clearly uncomfortable. Most of them looked the way people look when they have already decided what they are going to do, and simply need the ceremony to finish, so they can go home. I thought about what home meant. I thought about the Silence War, which ended 40 years before I was born, when humanity was desperate and frightened and needed allies more than it needed pride. I thought about the first humans who signed the Alliance Charter, exhausted men and women who looked at the stars and saw danger everywhere, and who reached out to whatever hands were offered because they needed the help. I thought about 200 years of bleeding for this organization. I thought about the frontier colonies that humanity built and defended, the supply routes that human engineers designed, the medical research that human doctors spent lifetimes developing, the quiet back-channel diplomacy that human ambassadors conducted in dark corners of a dozen stations to keep minor conflicts from becoming major ones. I thought about all of it, and then the vote was called. 13 hands rose. Mine stayed on the table. Threx nodded slowly, as if this too was expected. "The resolution passes," said Councillor Breck in his careful, expensive voice. "The Terran Compact is recognized for the record as the sole dissenting vote." The hall was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. I reached up and unclipped the Alliance medallion from my collar. It was a flat silver disc, engraved with the 14 founding symbols of the member species. Warm from sitting against my skin through the long session, I had worn it for 9 years. My predecessor had worn one for 14 years before that. I set it on the table in front of me. The sound it made when it touched the surface was very small, barely a click. But in the silence of that hall, every set of eyes in the room moved to it. I stood up. "The Terran Compact hereby withdraws from the Galactic Alliance," I said. "This withdrawal is effective immediately, in accordance with Article 19 of the Alliance Charter, which every member present helped draft and every member present signed. Our delegation will not be attending further sessions. Our ships will be departing Alliance-designated space within 72 hours. Our infrastructure contracts will be concluded according to the terms of each individual agreement." I paused. I looked at Threx. His smile had not moved, but something behind his 4 eyes had shifted very slightly. Not alarm, not quite. Something more like the first distant awareness of a sound that did not belong. "We wish the Alliance every success," I said. "We genuinely mean that." The hall erupted. Voices in 7 languages hit the translator arrays at once and turned into a wall of overlapping sound. 2 of the smaller species delegates were on their feet. Councillor Breck was saying something about procedure. One of the Dravathi representatives was gesturing sharply at her colleagues. And Threx, through all of it, sat very still and looked at me with that slow smile finally fading into something I had never seen on his face before. He thought it was a bluff. I could see it clearly. He thought this was a negotiating tactic, a display of wounded pride, a performance designed to extract concessions. He had dealt with humans for 20 years, and in that time he had learned to read us as a species that talked loudly and then found a compromise. He was already calculating what offer would be enough to bring us back to the table. I picked up my briefcase. I straightened my uniform jacket. I turned and walked toward the hall doors. My earpiece crackled once with a short burst of encrypted signal. It was the confirmation I had been waiting for. Back on Earth, the Prime Council had just formally ratified the withdrawal on the public record. Every human ship in Alliance-designated space had already begun its pre-departure procedures. Logistics teams on 47 human-run stations were beginning the handover protocols we had quietly prepared over the past 6 months. Every contract, every supply arrangement, every joint operation was being wound down in an orderly, legal, and completely irreversible sequence. We had not done this in anger. We had done it carefully. We had done it the way humans do everything that matters, by planning for it long before anyone expected us to. I pushed open the hall doors and walked out into the corridor. Behind me, I could still hear the noise from the chamber. Voices climbing over each other, the sharp clicks of Vreth formal protest, the low harmonic hum that Marathi counselors made when they were distressed. I did not stop. I did not look back. My aide, Lieutenant Cord Halsey, was waiting in the corridor with 2 junior staff members and a very controlled expression on his young face. He had known this was coming. He fell into step beside me without a word, and we walked together down the long pale corridor toward the docking ring where the transport was. Waiting. "How did Threx take it?" Cord asked after a moment. "He still thinks it is a bluff," I said. Cord was quiet for a few steps. Then he said, "He will stop thinking that fairly soon." "Yes," I said. "He will." We walked past the great observation window at the end of the corridor. Outside, the stars hung in their permanent, indifferent spread across the dark. Somewhere out there, humanity's fleet was turning for home. Somewhere out there, 200 years of careful, costly partnership was officially over. I did not feel triumph. I did not feel grief. I felt the strange, enormous lightness of a person who has just set down something very heavy, and is only now noticing how much it weighed. They laughed when we left. They stopped laughing 6 weeks later. The first thing I noticed on the voyage home was the silence. Not the silence of space, which I had long ago made peace with. The silence of my own crew, not the anxious, nervous quiet of people who are afraid they have done something wrong. The other kind, the quiet of people who have done something large and are still measuring exactly how large it is. I commanded the Terran combat ship Unbroken, a carrier-class vessel that had spent the last 4 years operating out of Kepler Station, as humanity's primary military presence in the Central Alliance Zone. She was a good ship, solid, well-maintained crew of 260. My people had been living alongside Alliance personnel for years, sharing mess halls and briefing rooms and the particular, awkward closeness of people who need each other professionally, but have never quite decided whether they are friends. That was over now. We were 3 days out of Kepler Station, running a clean transit line toward the Sol approach corridor, and I was in my command chair with a cold cup of coffee and a stack of intercepted Alliance communications that my signals officer, Lieutenant Petra Holm, had been quietly collecting since the moment we left the station. Petra was 26 precise, and had the particular gift of being able to read 4 simultaneous data streams without losing the thread of any of them. She set a new batch of transcripts on my side console without being asked and said, in a voice that carried no judgment at all, "It is getting louder, Admiral." That was an understatement. The Alliance emergency frequency, which was supposed to be reserved for hostile contact events and catastrophic station failures, had been running continuously since roughly 14 hours after our departure. Most of the traffic was internal, species to species, faction to faction, the kind of rapid, overlapping communication that happens when a large organization suddenly discovers that a load-bearing wall it thought was decorative has been quietly holding up the entire structure. I read through the transcripts slowly, the way you read something when you want to understand it rather than simply absorb it. The Dravathi had 3 border stations running on emergency power. because the supply contracts for their primary fuel cells had been managed through a human logistics firm based on Europa Station. That firm had, in accordance with the legal terms of the withdrawal, suspended all active contracts. The Dravathi had known this clause existed. They had simply never believed it would be invoked. The Marathi were in crisis over a medical shortage. For reasons that were clear to anyone who had spent time in Alliance research facilities, but apparently invisible to the Council, the majority of advanced pharmaceutical synthesis work in the Alliance had been done by human-operated labs. The Marathi suffered from a chronic blood pressure condition that affected roughly 40% of their adult population. The treatment was manufactured on a station orbiting Titan. That station had not stopped operating, but the Marathi Health Ministry had just discovered that their entire reserve stockpile was 8 weeks deep, because for 11 years they had relied on regular human resupply, rather than maintaining their own production capacity. They had been asked, several times over the years, to develop independent production. The suggestion had never gone anywhere. It had been easier to rely on us. I set down that particular transcript and looked at the window for a while. A smaller item near the bottom of Petra's stack was a routine diplomatic communication that had been sent through what its senders believed was a secure personal channel. It was not actually secure. It never had been. Human signals engineers had quietly noted the encryption weakness years ago and simply never mentioned it, because you do not inform a person that their private channel is readable unless you have decided you want them to know. The message was from Ambassador Threx to his government's home council. It had been sent approximately 31 hours after our departure. It was still formally confident in its tone. Threx was too experienced a diplomat to let panic into his official communications, even private ones. But between the formal language and the careful phrasing, I could read it the way you read the face of someone who is trying very hard not to look worried. He was writing to ask whether the Vreth Dominion should consider offering humanity some kind of formal concession to encourage a return to negotiations. He described our departure as procedurally significant but reversible. He used the word leverage 4 times in 12 paragraphs, always in reference to what the Alliance still held. He did not write the word mistake, but it was present in the message the way a shadow is present even when you are not looking directly at it. Cord Halsey came and stood beside my chair with his own coffee, reading over my shoulder in the informal way he had been allowed since I promoted him 6 months ago. After a moment he said, very quietly, "He still does not understand. He understands the pieces," I said. "He does not understand the whole picture yet." Cord nodded slowly. He had a way of thinking through problems that I had always appreciated, patient and methodical, like someone assembling something careful from small components. He said, "He thinks we left because we were angry about the vote." Yes. "We left because the vote was the last in a very long line." Yes. Cord was quiet for a moment. Outside the observation panel, the stars moved in their slow, untroubled way. Then he said, "How long before they understand what they actually lost?" I had been thinking about that question since before we left the station. The honest answer was that they were beginning to understand it already, in fragments, in the way that the Dravathi border stations were going dark, and the Marathi Health Ministry was making panicked calls, and a dozen smaller friction points were surfacing across the Alliance all at once. But understanding in fragments is not the same as understanding completely. You can feel individual tiles shift beneath your feet, without realizing that the entire floor is moving. There was another element that I had not shared with anyone yet, except the Prime Council. I pulled it up on my personal screen and read through it again. 6 weeks before our departure, a Scourge patrol had entered the Harkin corridor, which ran along the far edge of what had been Alliance-protected space. The Scourge were not a species in any way that the word was usually meant. They were something older, something expansionist in a way that operated by instinct rather than strategy, and for 80 years humanity had been the primary military force standing between them and the inner systems. Not because the Alliance had asked us to. Because our colonies were in the way and we had decided early on that we would rather fight than retreat. 80 years. No other species in the Alliance had sent significant forces to the Scourge frontier. A few had offered token ships, logistic support, the occasional specialist crew. The Dravathi had passed 3 resolutions formally recognizing humanity's contribution to collective security, which was a very dignified way of thanking people for bleeding so that others did not have to. The patrol in the Harkin corridor had been repelled by a human frontier garrison. That garrison was now in the process of pulling back toward Terran-designated space, in accordance with the withdrawal plan. The corridor would be unguarded in 11 days. I had included this information in the briefing package sent to all Alliance Council members on the day of our departure. I had made it clear, in language that left no room for misunderstanding, that human forces would no longer be operating beyond Terran-designated boundaries. I had recommended that the Alliance immediately deploy its own forces to cover the gap. None of them had responded to that section of the briefing. I was not surprised. The Council had not made a significant military deployment decision in decades because they had not needed to. Humanity handled the frontier. Humanity always handled the frontier. The idea that this was a situation requiring their direct attention had not yet become real to them, in the way that something abstract and distant is never quite real until it is suddenly close and loud and unavoidable. Petra appeared at my elbow with a new sheet. Dravathi military is moving ships toward the Harkon corridor, she said. Looks like a reaction force. 6 vessels. I looked at the numbers. That is not enough. No, she agreed in her careful, no-judgment voice. They will figure that out when they get there, I said. Cord had gone back to his own station but looked over at that. His expression was not pleased exactly, but it was the expression of a person watching something that they knew was inevitable, and that they had warned about, and that was now simply happening. The Alliance had spent 200 years telling themselves that humanity was the aggressive one, the overcautious one, the one always preparing for threats that the other species were wise enough not to fear. They had passed resolutions to limit our fleet. They had voted to restrict our movement. They had expressed, in formal diplomatic language and in the quiet contempt of 100 corridor conversations, the opinion that humanity was too focused on defense, too militaristic, too unwilling to trust in the peace that the Alliance maintained. Now the Scourged was in the Harkon corridor, and there were 6 Dravathi ships going to meet them, and I was 3 days from home, and for the first time in 80 years, humanity was not going to be the one standing between the threat and the rest of the stars. I thought about the Dravathi ambassador, the one who had cast his vote with Threx without hesitation, who had spoken in the council chamber about the dangers of unilateral military expansion. I thought about what his face might look like when his 6 ships encountered what was waiting in the Harkon corridor. I did not feel good about that thought. I want to be honest about that. I did not feel good about any of this in the clean, simple way that people sometimes imagine when they picture a wronged party finally being proven right. Being proven right, when the proof comes in the form of suffering that you could not prevent and would not have chosen, is a hollow kind of victory. But I also did not feel that we had made the wrong decision. There is a difference between causing harm and refusing to continue absorbing it. The Alliance had passed a resolution to cage us. They had done it because they were afraid of us. And the reason they were afraid of us, the real reason that lived beneath all the formal language and the diplomatic positioning, was this. They had always known, somewhere underneath the medallions and the charter ceremonies and the long, comfortable years of letting us handle the hard work, that humanity was the reason the lights were still on across these stars. We had known it too. We had simply spent 200 years being too polite to say so. Cord set a mug of fresh coffee on my console. It was exactly the right temperature. He had been doing that since the first day he served on my ship, appearing at the right moment with the right thing without being asked. It was one of his best qualities. He did not say anything, neither did I. The Unbroken moved through the dark. Far behind us, the Alliance scrambled and communicated, and tried to patch the holes that our leaving had opened up, the way you try to patch a hull with your hands after the section has already separated. Far ahead of us, Earth was waiting, with its blue oceans and its complicated history, and the Prime Council that had already begun drafting the framework for something new. I read Threx's message one more time before closing my screen. He still thought it was leverage. He still thought we would come back. I finished my coffee and watched the stars, and thought about how much it changes a person. The moment they finally set down a weight they have been carrying so long they forgot it was not part of them. I did not feel victorious. I felt tired, and for the first time in my life genuinely free. My name is Corin Mast and I am not a soldier. I want to be clear about that because the events I am about to describe are events that most people, when they hear about them later, imagine through the lens of military confrontation, fleet movements, the language of force and countermeasure. The reality, at least from where I was standing, looked more like an extremely long series of difficult conversations in small rooms with uncomfortable chairs. I was appointed as the Terran Compact's chief civilian envoy 3 months after the withdrawal. I was 34 years old. I had previously served as a trade negotiation specialist for the Compact's Outer Colonies Bureau, which meant that my entire professional life had been built around sitting across tables from people who wanted different things from me and finding the precise arrangement of words and terms that would allow everyone to leave the room, feeling that they had not entirely lost. The Prime Council gave me an office on Luna's diplomatic quarter, a staff of 9, and a situation that could only be described, with complete honesty, as extraordinary. Within the first 6 weeks after the withdrawal, My office received 412 formal contact requests from former Alliance member species, non-aligned entities, trading houses, independent station operators, and at least 3 organizations that I still cannot entirely identify. Some of these requests were straightforward, businesses wanting to know if existing commercial relationships would continue, research institutions asking about shared data agreements, that kind of thing. Others were more complicated. The most complicated ones came from governments. I want to describe for you the shape of what was happening in the Alliance during those months, because it is important context for understanding why the conversations in my office were happening at all. The Alliance had not collapsed. I want to be precise about that, because the word collapse implies a sudden structural failure, and what was actually happening was more gradual and in some ways more revealing. The Alliance was fracturing along lines that had always been there. Humanity, through 2 centuries of quiet mediation and back-channel diplomacy, had been one of the primary forces preventing those fractures from opening into full splits. We were not the only such force, but we were a significant one, and our absence created space for old grievances to rise. The Polari and the Synth had been in a slow territorial dispute over a shared asteroid belt for 60 years. Humanity had maintained a small but consistent diplomatic presence that kept the dispute in negotiation, rather than allowing it to escalate. With that presence gone, both sides found themselves without a neutral party they both trusted. The dispute sharpened rapidly. By the 2nd month after the withdrawal, there were Polari and Synth ships making aggressive transit passes through each other's claimed zones. Consortium, a group of 4 smaller species that had always operated as a voting bloc within the Alliance, had been held together in part by mutual economic agreements that humanity's trade infrastructure supported. With the human trade network no longer operating through Alliance channels, 2 of the 4 consortium species began quietly seeking separate deals with larger powers. The consortium started to come apart. 2 species that I will not name here, because their situations were genuinely delicate, found themselves in the position of realizing that their Alliance membership had protected them from larger neighbors not because the Alliance had any particular interest in their survival, but because humanity had, and humanity had expressed that interest through its presence and its relationships in ways that were informal but real. Without us, the protection was still formally on paper. It was just no longer enforced by anyone. I am not saying all of this to suggest that humanity was irreplaceable, or that the Alliance was nothing without us. That would be both arrogant and incorrect. The Alliance had real institutions, real mechanisms, real member species with genuine commitment to its principles. But institutions are built by people, and sustained by the ongoing choices of people, and the choice to do the daily, unglamorous, expensive work of keeping something functional had, for 2 centuries, been made disproportionately by one species. We had not known how to stop making that choice while remaining inside the Alliance. So we left. The formal request for humanity to rejoin the Alliance arrived at my office on a Tuesday morning. It was delivered through the Alliance diplomatic channel, addressed to the Prime Council, and signed by 9 of the 13 remaining member species. The terms offered were the original Alliance charter terms, unchanged, which meant that the withdrawal had cost us nothing in formal standing. I was in the room when Prime Councilor Adele Farrow read it. She was a tall woman, gray-haired, with the particular patience of someone who had spent 40 years in politics and learned that most situations that felt urgent were not, and the ones that actually were urgent rarely announced themselves loudly. She read the request twice. She set it down. She looked at me. Then she looked at the 4 other council members in the room. "Thoughts?" she said. The discussion took 4 minutes and 12 seconds. I know because I checked the meeting log afterward. There was no drama. There was no long deliberation. There was simply a group of people looking at a document and asking the same question from slightly different angles. Does this change anything? And arriving at the same answer, no. The council declined the request formally and politely, citing the Terran Compact's current trajectory of building independent structures that better served humanity's actual needs and values. The language was respectful. The door was left open for future cooperation on specific matters of mutual interest. The Alliance did not respond for 9 days. I want to talk about the other conversations, the ones that mattered more and that the public record does not fully capture. Because they happened quietly and carefully, the way things happen when both sides are serious. There were 3 of them, 3 separate species, 3 separate envoys, all arriving at Luna within the same 2-week window, all requesting meetings with me specifically rather than with the formal diplomatic office. The first was a small, quick-moving species called the Ayan, with large dark eyes and a manner of speaking that involved very long pauses that I had learned not to interrupt. Their envoy was a senior official named Advisor Loth, who arrived at my office with 2 aides and sat down across from me, with the careful posture of someone who had rehearsed this meeting many times and was now discovering that the reality of it was slightly different from the rehearsal. He said, after the formal greetings and the necessary pleasantries, that the Ion government had long been uncomfortable within the alliance. He said this without drama, almost academically. He noted that the alliance's decision-making structures consistently favored the interests of its larger, older members. He said that the Ion had stayed because leaving alone felt dangerous. Then he paused for a very long time. Then he said, "You have demonstrated that it is possible to leave and not be destroyed." I said, "Yes, we have." He paused again. "We are interested in understanding what comes next for the Terran Compact." I told him about the Compact Treaty Network. I had been drafting the framework for 3 weeks at that point, working with a small team of trade lawyers, military strategists, and 2 diplomats who had specifically requested reassignment from the formal State Department because they wanted to be part of building something new rather than maintaining something old. The network was not an alliance. It had no central governing body, no charter of shared obligations, no council that could vote to restrict its members. It was a web of individual bilateral agreements, each one negotiated separately, each one existing on its own terms. You did not join the network, you joined an agreement, and then perhaps another one, and then perhaps another. And over time, if the agreements were good ones built on genuine mutual benefit, you found yourself connected to a web of relationships that provided the same practical security and economic support that a formal alliance provided, but without surrendering the ability to make your own decisions. Loth was quiet for a long time after I finished explaining. Then he said, "This is a very human idea." I thought about that. "I suppose it is," I said. "We have a long history of building networks rather than hierarchies. We do it with our infrastructure, our trade routes, our scientific research. We are probably better at it than we are at institutions." He asked if the Ion could apply to begin treaty discussions. I told him that was exactly the process. The second envoy was from the Kala, a gentle, long-lived species that had been alliance members since near the founding, and whose government had, according to my reading of the public record, abstained on Resolution 7741C rather than voting for it. Their representative was a quiet woman named Ambassador Rin, who had spent 40 years working in Alliance diplomatic service and who sat down across from me with the expression of someone who had thought about this conversation for a long time. She did not ask to leave the Alliance. She asked something different. She asked whether the Terran Compact would be willing to maintain its emergency medical supply agreements with Kala, administered stations independently of any political arrangement, purely as a commercial matter. I said yes, of course. We had never had any intention of cutting off medical supplies. The legal withdrawal had been carefully structured to end political and military obligations while keeping commercial relationships available to any party that wanted to maintain them. I told her this. She looked at me for a moment with a slightly complicated expression. Then she said, "I apologize for the vote. My government's instruction was to abstain, and I abstained, but I want you to know that I argued against the resolution in private." I told her that I appreciated her saying so. She nodded slowly. "We spent a great deal of time fearing the wrong thing," she said. I asked her what she meant. She said, "We were afraid of humanity becoming too powerful. We never considered what it would look like if humanity simply chose to stop helping." I did not know what to say to that, so I said nothing. Sometimes the most important thing a diplomat can do is stay quiet and let a true thing remain in the air of the room without trying to improve upon. The third envoy was the one that stayed with me longest. He was from a species called the Neth, small and quick and extremely intelligent, and his name was Representative Vale. He arrived with no aides, which was unusual, and he began the meeting not with diplomatic pleasantries but with a direct question. He said, "Is the Compact Treaty Network designed to become a replacement for the Alliance?" I said no, he said. "Do you intend for it to grow until it functionally replaces the Alliance?" I considered that more carefully. I said, "We intend for it to grow until every species that wants a better arrangement than the Alliance offers has an alternative available to them." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That is the same answer." I thought about that on and off for several days afterward. He was not wrong. Exactly. But I was not wrong either. The distinction mattered, even if the outcome looked similar. We were not building an empire. We were not building a new hierarchy with humanity at the top. We were building a demonstration. We were showing what was possible when you designed cooperation around actual relationships rather than formal structures. The difference between a network and an institution is that a network does not require you to sacrifice your judgment to belong to it. You can be connected and still be sovereign. You can cooperate without surrendering the right to say no. That was the idea. That was what we were building. Meanwhile, the Alliance continued its slow, complicated process of understanding what had changed. The Scourge incursion into the Harkon corridor had been repelled, but not without significant losses to the Dravathi ships that had rushed there, without adequate preparation or support. The response within the Alliance had been, from what I could see, a mixture of anger and a dawning reckoning that nobody was quite ready to say out loud. The fear that was spreading across the stars was not, as many people seemed to assume, fear of humanity doing something aggressive. We had done nothing aggressive. We had left a table. We had returned to our own space. We had begun building new relationships on terms we chose. The fear was different. The fear was the recognition, spreading through species after species as the implications unfolded in real time, that the order they had lived inside for 2 centuries had been maintained not by the Alliance's institutions, but by humanity's willingness to do the work those institutions required. And now that willingness was directed elsewhere, towards something new, something that had no room for a vote, like the one that had been taken on Kepler Station. Advisor Loth signed the first Ion-Terran trade cooperation agreement on a Thursday afternoon in my small Luna office, with no ceremony and no press present. It was 16 pages long and covered 12 specific areas of mutual economic interest. It was the 43rd agreement I had signed since taking this position. It would not be the last. We were not building an empire. We were building something far more dangerous to those who feared us. We were building an example. 6 months after the withdrawal, the Vreth came with warships. I want to describe this correctly, which means being precise about what it felt like from the inside rather than how it would later be written about in the news feeds and the political analyses, and the 3 separate historical accounts that I have already been told are being prepared, none of which I have agreed to contribute to. From the inside, it felt like the long, careful conclusion of a move that had been visible for weeks. I had been given command of the Human Response Force by the Prime Council's Defense Committee 8 days before the Vreth fleet entered the Kandari Passage. The committee had sent me a brief, direct briefing document that contained 3 things: the intelligence assessment of Vreth intentions, the resources I was being allocated, and a short paragraph at the end that said, in the careful language of people who trust you to understand what they are not saying directly, that the outcome of this situation would shape every diplomatic and military relationship the Terran Compact would have for the next 50 years. The resources I was allocated were 11 ships. The Vreth fleet was 40 vessels, all military class, fully armed, and moving in the tight formation that indicated they had been traveling together, long enough to have run combat drills. My crew, when the final count came in and was confirmed, went very quiet in the way that people go quiet when they are recalibrating their understanding of a situation. My pilot, Lieutenant Owen Marsh, a compact, steady man who had been flying under my command for 6 years and who I trusted completely, looked at the numbers on his screen and then looked at me and said, in a perfectly even voice, 11, I confirmed. He nodded slowly. And we are going to the Kandari Passage. Yes, he thought about that for a moment. Then he said, I have served under worse odds. So have I said. Bring us in. The Kandari Passage was a narrow corridor of navigable space between 2 dense debris fields, roughly 40 light minutes across at its widest point. Humanity had built a station there 91 years ago, using our own funding, our own materials, and our own labor to support the supply routes that fed the outer colonies. The station was called Kandari Hub. It had 312 permanent staff, 4 docking rings, a medical facility, a research wing, and the best coffee in the outer zones, which was relevant primarily because 2 members of my crew mentioned it during the transit, and I mention it now because human details matter even in large moments. The station had been registered at the time of its construction as a Terran Compact commercial facility. That registration was current. It had been renewed every 5 years without interruption for 9 decades. The Vreth claimed, through a formal broadcast transmitted to every open frequency in the passage, that humanity was illegally occupying a strategic transit zone, and demanded that we vacate the station and withdraw our vessels. The broadcast arrived while I was eating breakfast. I read it twice. I set down my coffee, which was in fact very good. I picked up the formal registration documents for Kandari Hub, which my legal officer, a methodical woman named Commander Wren Adley, had prepared and organized in exactly the order I would need them, because Wren was the kind of person who had documents ready before you asked for them and who I had specifically requested for this mission for exactly that reason. I did not respond to the Vreth broadcast. I let 47 minutes pass. During those 47 minutes, I reviewed the documents Wren had prepared. I reviewed the legal frameworks under which the station had been registered, which included the Alliance Commercial Infrastructure Protocol, the Outer Zone Transit Agreement, and an independent registration that the Terran Compact had filed with 3 neutral legal bodies 18 months before the withdrawal for exactly this kind of situation. I read the Vreth Dominion's own signed copies of 2 of those 3 frameworks, which were part of the public record. Then I reviewed what my other 10 ships had been doing during the 47 minutes. They had been positioning themselves very carefully throughout the passage, not in combat formation, not in any arrangement that could be interpreted as an aggressive stance, but in a very specific geometric spread that ensured maximum sensor coverage of the entire passage and full signal lock on every ship in the Vreth fleet, every ship ID, every weapon system, every communication transmission, every maneuver. All of it was being recorded in real time on every channel we had, and all of it was being broadcast, live, to 47 receiving stations across Terran space, Kala space, Ion space, and 4 independent relay networks that did not belong to any government, and therefore could not be legally pressured to stop broadcasting. Then I opened a channel to the Vreth fleet. The Vreth admiral's name was Commander Reth Voran. He appeared on my screen as a large, dark-furred being with the compact face and wide-set eyes of his species, wearing the full formal uniform of the Vreth military, which involved a great many angular metal decorations that I had always privately found somewhat excessive. He looked at me with the expression that senior military officers adopt when they want to convey, without directly stating, that they consider themselves to be in a position of complete authority. I said, "Commander Voran, thank you for your patience. I apologize for the delay in responding. I was completing a review of the relevant documentation," he said. "Admiral Voss, your vessels are occupying a zone that the Vreth Dominion considers." I said, "I understand the position you have communicated. I want to provide you with some information that may be relevant to your government's decision-making." He paused. The pause was very brief, but it was there. I proceeded to explain, in clear and precise terms, the legal status of Kandari Hub and the waters around it. I explained the 3 frameworks under which the station was registered, and the Terran Compact's sovereign claim to the zone was established. I noted, without emotion, that the Vreth Dominion had signed 2 of those frameworks, and that their own legal archives would contain certified copies. I then told him that his fleet's presence in the passage had been on record from the moment they entered it, that every ship identifier, weapon signature, communication, and maneuver had been documented, and that this documentation was currently being broadcast live to 47 receiving stations. I said, "Any action taken against Terran sovereign assets in this passage will be on the record. Every government in the region will have an unedited account of exactly what happened, in real time, before any official version of events is released by any party." Voran looked at me. His expression had not changed, but his forefingers, which had been resting on the arm of his command chair, were now pressed flat and still, and I had spent enough years across tables from Vreth officials to know that this was what stillness looked like when it was being maintained, deliberately. I said, "I want to be direct with you, Commander, because I think you are a practical person and I believe practical people prefer direct communication. Your government's position is that this station does not legally belong to the Terran Compact. My government's position, supported by 3 independent legal frameworks and 91 years of registered occupation, is that it does. Resolving that dispute is a matter for lawyers and negotiators. Attempting to resolve it through military action, in full view of 47 recording stations, would not benefit the Vreth Dominion regardless of the outcome." Another pause. Longer this time. He said, "You have 11 ships, Admiral," I said. "I know." He said, "My fleet outnumbers yours considerably." I said, "I know that too." He said nothing for a moment. I said nothing. The silence on the channel was the particular kind of silence that exists when 2 people are each waiting to see what the other one understands. I let it sit. Then I said, "I came here with 11 ships and a recording, Commander. Not because 11 ships are sufficient to defeat 40, but because 11 ships are sufficient to document everything that happens here. And what gets documented here, today in this passage, will determine how every government in this region of space thinks about the Vreth Dominion for the next generation." Voran was still for a long time. Then he said, "We will be submitting a formal dispute through the appropriate legal channels." I said, "That is exactly the appropriate process, and we welcome it." The channel closed. For 3 hours and 14 minutes, the Vreth fleet held position at the far end of the passage. My crew was quiet. Owen kept us on a clean, stable heading. Ren prepared the initial legal response documents, because she was Ren, and she had already anticipated this outcome. My communications officer tracked the signal traffic from the Vreth fleet without comment. Then the Vreth fleet began to move, not toward us away, back the way they had come in the measured, careful way of a formation that was retreating without wanting to look like it was retreating. Owen watched the sensor display for a moment. Then he said, in his perfectly even voice, "They are leaving." "Yes," I said. He thought about this. He said, "We did not fire a single weapon." "No." I said. Another moment. Then he said, "Is this what diplomacy always looks like?" I thought about that. "When it works," I said. The news feeds picked up the story about 4 hours later, because the broadcast record was public and 47 receiving stations meant 47 separate points of confirmation. The story that spread was not primarily about the size of the fleets or the legal dispute over the station. The story that spread was about the recording, about the fact that humanity had walked into a confrontation outnumbered 4-1 and had brought, as its primary instrument, not more weapons but complete transparency. I read some of the commentary that evening, sitting in my cabin, while Owen held our position in the passage, and the rest of the crew slowly came down from the quiet, controlled tension of the day. There were takes from species I had never heard of, running through relay networks I barely knew existed, discussing what had happened in the Kandari passage. Some of them were hostile to us, some were analytical. A few were something I had not expected and did not entirely know what to do with, which was admiring. Not admiring in the way you admire military strength. Admiring in the way you admire a solution that you did not know existed to a problem you thought had only 2 bad answers. I found a message in my personal queue from Advisor Lothar. It said, in the Ion style that used very few words to say precise things, "We have been watching. We understand better now what kind of strength you carry." I read it several times. Then I read the Vreth news broadcasts, which were describing the day as an ongoing legal matter being referred to. Appropriate bodies, which was the diplomatic language for. We attempted a confrontation, it did not go the way we expected, and we are now pretending it was administrative all along. Threx, I noticed, had not commented publicly. I thought about what he was thinking. I thought about the slow, careful process of a very intelligent person updating a model that had turned out to be wrong in ways that were becoming progressively impossible to ignore. I thought about what it felt like to watch an opponent operate in a way that was entirely outside the categories you had prepared for. I had not come to the Kandari passage to demonstrate strength. I had come to demonstrate something more unsettling to those who feared us. I had come to demonstrate patience. Humanity plays long games. We have always played long games. We plan for contingencies years before they arise. We document, we register, we file the legal frameworks before the disputes begin. We bring the recording equipment before the confrontation starts. We do not rely on being stronger in the moment. We rely on having prepared better before the moment arrived. The Vreth came with 40 ships to frighten me. I came with 11 and a recording. Every news feed across the galaxy that night carried the same story, and the story was not about the ships. It never had been. My name is still Saravas. I am no longer an admiral in the active sense of the word. My current title, bestowed by the Prime Council 3 weeks ago in a ceremony I tried unsuccessfully to have simplified, is Special Representative to the Terran Compact Assembly. I speak at things, I attend things, I am consulted about things. It is, I confess, considerably less satisfying than commanding a ship, but it comes with better chairs, and I have been told, multiple times, by people whose political judgment I respect, that the work matters. I believe them. I am trying to believe them more fully with each passing week. 1 year ago today, I set a silver medallion on a table in front of representatives of 14 alien species and walked out of the Grand Conclave Hall on Kepler Station. Today I am standing in the New Geneva Assembly Hall on Earth, looking out at a room that holds people I could not have imagined filling this space 12 months ago. There are human delegates here, from Earth, from 14 colony worlds, from the deep space stations that have been operating independently for decades. There are Ion delegates, formal and careful, with their long pauses and their precise language. There are Kala representatives, gentle and attentive. There are Neth observers in the gallery. There are 6 other species present in various formal and informal capacities, each one here through a different route, each one connected to the Compact Treaty Network through a specific web of agreements that fit their particular situation rather than a single charter that required everyone to be the same kind of member. This is not the Galactic Alliance. I want to say that clearly, because comparisons are already being made, and I think they miss what is genuinely different about this room. The Alliance was built on the idea that collective security required collective governance, which in practice meant that the species with the most influence shaped the rules, and everyone else accepted them, in exchange for the protection those rules offered. It was not a cynical design. The people who built it believed in it, but the gap between what it promised and what it delivered had been growing for a long time before I walked out of that hall. What is in this room is something else. It is harder to describe because it does not have a clean name yet. Network is the word we use, but it understates the depth of what has grown here. Community is closer, but it implies more uniformity than actually exists. What it really is, I think, is a collection of relationships, real ones, negotiated specifically between actual parties with actual interests, not written into a master document and handed to everyone as a condition of participation. Prime Counselor Farrow asked me to speak today. She was characteristically direct about why. She said, "You walked out first. You should explain what we walked into." I thought about that for a long time. I spent 2 weeks trying to write a speech and throwing it away. I wrote about the Kandari Passage and then deleted it. I wrote about the Scourge Frontier and then deleted that too. I wrote something that was more like an after-action report than anything that belonged in a room like this, which perhaps says something about my limits as a public speaker, and my continuing inclination to think of every situation as a tactical problem. What I finally decided to talk about was something smaller. 43 days after the withdrawal, when I was back on Earth for the first round of briefings, and had a single afternoon free, I took a long walk along the coast near my childhood home in what used to be called Southern England. I had not been there in 3 years. The sea was gray and restless, and the wind came in off the water smelling of cold and distance. There was nobody else on the path. I walked for 2 hours. I thought about everything. I thought about the medallion and the vote, and the 200 years of service, and the Harkin, Corridor and Cord Halsey appearing at my elbow with exactly the right cup of coffee at exactly the right moment. I thought about what we had built, what we were building, what we had given up and what we had gained. And I thought about something my grandmother told me once, when I was very young, and she was very old, and we were sitting on her porch watching the evening come in over the hills. She had served in a different kind of service, the kind that stays on one planet, and she had spent her life working in the field of international law, back when international still meant just the nations of one world. She had spent decades working on frameworks that most people never knew existed, and that functioned precisely because they operated without ceremony. She said, "The most important agreements are the ones nobody notices. They are the ones holding everything up." I have thought about that sentence many times in the past year. I thought about it in the Kandari Passage. I thought about it reading Advisor Loth's brief message. I thought about it standing in this room today. What humanity built, inside the Alliance, over 2 centuries, was exactly that kind of agreement. We built it informally, incrementally, without ceremony or recognition. We built it in the frontier colonies, and the supply routes, and the medical labs, and the quiet back-channel conversations, and the 8 decades of holding the line against the scourge, without ever being formally asked to, and without ever stopping. We built something enormous and essential and invisible. And we built it so well that by the time it mattered, everyone had forgotten it was built at all. They had started to assume it had always simply existed. The fear that spread across the stars when we left was not fear of what we would do next. It was the fear of absence. The fear that comes when something you relied on so completely that you forgot to see it is suddenly gone. And in the silence that follows, you realize for the first time what it was actually doing. I think about the Dravathi ambassador who led the vote to restrict us. I have tried, in the years since that day, to think about him fairly. He was not a simple person. He was not purely cynical or purely arrogant. He was afraid. The Vreth, the Dravathi, the larger species in the Alliance, they were afraid of humanity's growth because they understood, better than they admitted, that humanity was exceptional, and exceptional things are unpredictable. And unpredictable things are frightening when you have organized your entire sense of security around them. Their mistake was trying to manage that fear by limiting us. You cannot make yourself safer by reducing the capability of the thing that has been keeping you safe. That is a lesson that sounds obvious when stated plainly. It is apparently very difficult to learn when you are the one making the decision. I am told the Galactic Alliance is still meeting. I am told the sessions are shorter now and the agenda is mostly procedural. 4 species have submitted applications to begin treaty discussions with the Compact Network. The Vreth legal dispute over the Kandari Passage is moving through an arbitration process that our legal team has assessed will conclude in our favor in approximately 18 months. The Scourge situation is more complicated. I am not going to stand here and pretend that it is not the item on the list that keeps me awake. The communication that arrived in human space 4 months ago, the first direct contact the Scourge has ever initiated with any species, was 3 sentences long and was transmitted on a frequency that human signals engineers had flagged as a possible Scourge operational band 11. Years ago, nobody else had ever identified it. I have read those 3 sentences many times. Our translation teams have been working on them continuously since arrival. What we currently believe they mean is something along the lines of, "You are the ones who stayed. We have been waiting to speak to the ones who stayed." I do not know what that means. Nobody does yet. What I know is that humanity will handle whatever it means. The same way we have always handled the large and complicated things that the universe puts in front of us, by showing up, by preparing before others think to prepare, by being patient enough to understand before acting, and by refusing to be diminished by those who fear us. I am going to say something in this assembly that I have been asked not to say by several of my advisors who are worried it sounds arrogant. I am going to say it anyway, because I think the moment requires honesty over comfort. Humanity is exceptional, not in the way that the arrogant say it, not as a ranking, not as a claim that we are better than others, or that others are less than us. Exceptional in the way that anything that grew through enormous difficulty, and sustained enormous effort, and survived things that should have ended, it and came out on the other side with its capacity to care still intact is exceptional. We are not the strongest species. We are not the longest lived. We are not the most technologically sophisticated by every measure. But we are the ones who showed up. We were the ones who held the frontier. We were the ones who kept the supply lines running, and the medical research moving, and the small disputes from becoming large catastrophes. We were the ones who stayed when staying was hard. And we were the ones who, when asked to make ourselves smaller as a condition of remaining, chose to leave instead. And now we are the ones building something new. I want to be careful with this. Power tends toward the habits that power develops, and if we are not thoughtful and deliberate and self-critical, the compact treaty network will gradually accumulate the same tendencies that made the alliance what it became. We will become the ones setting the terms. We will become the ones whose fear drives decisions. We will become the ones who sit in that hall and smile the slow smile of someone who knows the vote is already decided. I do not want that. I do not think anyone in this room wants that. I think the fact that this assembly was designed the way it was designed, as a network rather than a hierarchy, as a collection of relationships rather than a governing body, is evidence that we are trying to build something different. But trying is not the same as succeeding, and the work of making sure we remain what we intend to be is longer and harder than the work of building this in the first place. 1 year ago, I walked out of a room with a medallion on the table. Today, I am in a different room, with different people, building something that does not yet have a full name and does not yet know exactly what it will become. I find I am not afraid of that uncertainty. I have spent my life working in situations where the outcome was not guaranteed, and I have learned that the uncertainty itself is not the danger. The danger is losing your sense of who you are in the middle of navigating it. The danger is letting the pressure of large events push you into something you did not intend. We know who we are. We are the species that held the line for 80 years without being asked. We are the species that walked away from a table, rather than accept a smaller version of ourselves. We are the species that showed up to a confrontation with 11 ships and a recording, and went home having resolved it without a single weapon fired. We are the species that received 3 sentences from the Scourge, and, instead of responding with alarm, assembled a translation team and started asking what the sentences actually meant. We are the ones who build the invisible frameworks, who maintain the things nobody notices until they are gone, who plan for contingencies before the contingencies arise, who show up and stay. A journalist asked me once, a Dravathi journalist, which I will admit gave me a particular quiet pleasure, what humanity gained by leaving the alliance. She asked it as a challenge, expecting the answer to be complicated or defensive or both. I told her, everything we forgot we had. She wrote that down. I saw the piece later. She had titled it something that translated, roughly, as the humans who left and came back stronger. I thought that was not quite right, but I understood why she framed it that way. It is a human story structure: departure, trial, return, transformed. The reality is simpler. We did not return. We did not come back to what we were before. We moved forward into something we are still figuring out. And that, I think, is the most human thing of all. Not that we have arrived somewhere, not that we have won, but that we are still moving, still building, still reaching towards something slightly ahead of where we are, still refusing to be told that what we are is too much. They were afraid of us. They were never afraid of the right thing. They were afraid of our ships, our numbers, our presence on the frontier, our refusal to be managed. They should have been paying attention to something else entirely. They should have been paying attention to the fact that we never stopped. Not for 200 years inside their structure. Not in the year since we left it. Not today in this room, beginning this assembly, building this network of relationships that has no name yet and no final shape and no limit we can currently see. We never stop. That is what they should have feared. Not the ships, not the frontier, not the vote we cast alone and the medallion we left on the table. The fact that after everything, we got back up and started building again. The fear spread across the stars when we left, but it was never fear of what we would do to them. It was fear of what it said about them. that they had needed us for 200 years and never once admitted it, and that we had known, and stayed anyway, and worked anyway, and built anyway, and held the line anyway, until the day we finally quietly decided that was enough. And then we built something better. That is the story. That is all of it.